horror movies are some of the things that we love the most. We love to be terrified and entertained by the events that we see on screen, whether we're dealing with man-made horrors or the effects and attacks of nature upon a man-made world. Horror movies continue to scintillate and inspire imagination, but there is perhaps no greater inspiration for the horrors of the world than history itself. Hello everyone, my name is Kyle and welcome to Desks and Dorks. A couple of things: you all helped to vote for this. If you're not part of the Discord community or voting in the YouTube community tab, you can join them in the description below if you want to help us out. All of the YouTube pleasantries really do go quite a long way to doing so. And don't forget, the best way to support us, however, is by picking up a copy of some of our games. You can get digital ones over at itch.io by using that QR code or the link in the description, but you can get physical games from places like Tabletop Bookshelf. You can also get them from Indie Press Revolution and our good friends over at Exalted Funeral. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about horror movies. I'm going to be using a couple examples, and what better example to start with than Ferrante of Naples. Ferrante of Naples is an intriguing character because he was many things: an illegitimate son, a talented tactician, a relatively decent soldier, and a capable and effective leader. He was also a big fan of torture. You see, Ferrante, in addition to trying to usher Naples into a golden age during the Renaissance, was beset on all sides by enemies both foreign and domestic, and his way of subjugating and dealing with those opponents was with raw, unmitigated, and truly terrifying forms of torture. Now, Ferrante liked to use quite a bit of those things. This egg, by the way, is something that would be inserted into the rectum of the person that you are interested in hurting, and then once inserted, it would slowly be expanded, causing an unimaginable amount of damage. Obviously, that's kind of a horrific thing. It gets even more horrific when you realize that, guess what? This device would sometimes be heated up as well, have the metal be warmed or basically turned to scalding temperatures before it's inserted. So you have all kinds of things. However, that was not always common because sometimes it would cauterize or burn the nerves, which would thus render the device far less effective than useful. Ferrante also employed a number of different standing apparatus. Of course, Iron Maiden is not necessarily a highly popular one in Renaissance Italy, but it's just one that I think is evocative and something that we can talk about. Ferrante loved these torture devices because, again, they helped to inspire fear, but mostly they really and truly did one thing, and that was to help inspire terror rather than to try to get information. Ferrante knew that this was not an effective way of proceeding, but did it anyway because he had a reputation to uphold. That reputation got even worse when he put down a revolt by tricking the opposing side to come to a peace banquet where he had, again, had them all destroyed, unalived, taken out, however you want to deal with it. But what makes this really interesting is that it actually echoes something our good buddy Vlad the Impaler did. See, Ferrante was not one for waste, and after disposing of the bodies of these individuals who had the gall to revolt against him, and actually Ferrante had done this even prior to this moment, Ferrante liked to have those corpses mummified, and then if he thought you were disloyal, if he even had the whiff of conspiracy about you, he would bring you into what could only be described as a garden of mummified enemies. This is a truly horrific thing. Imagine stumbling into a dimly lit room. You think you're on your way to a banquet. Ferrante says, "Oh, I want to show you something." And then the torches, the braziers are lit, and all of a sudden you are face to face with an army of tied up kinsmen, friends, peers, acquaintances, all mummified, all staring out at you with horrified, lifeless eyes. It's something that is akin to something like the House of Wax, and I really think it's a wonderful source of inspiration for your role-playing games. But we're going to go and change shrift a little bit to wolf attacks. You see, there is something primal in the fear of the wolf, primal in the fear of large apex predators that are not us. It's something I think that's ingrained in our little Cro-Magnon brains, and whether or not we're thinking about the lone wolf or we're dealing with massive wolf packs like the one pictured here, or even a few savage ones like the ones pictured here, I think it's something that we actually have to take into account. It's a primal fear, an evolutionary fear, something baked in to our human DNA. But these horrific beasts were of a special interest in World War I. You see, on the Eastern Front between the Russians and the Germans, there was a wolf truce that was called. Now, I want to actually point out a historical inaccuracy that I found during the research for this video. Now, a couple sources reported erroneously to my findings that there were numerous wolf truces. I don't believe this is the case. Most of the findings and most of the research that I did corroborated that the wolf truce really only happened one time, or if it did happen additional times, it was in much smaller communities and on a far less official basis, probably between smaller squads or groups of lightly armed men making that deal for themselves, because, let's be real, World War I had a couple of those minor truces that sort of got glossed over and no one really truly needed. I didn't need a general's shall we say, permission to make those truces happen. But there was one major wolf truce that was called that I could find information about, which occurred when German and Russian forces fighting on the Eastern Front were realizing that large packs of wolves were not just attacking villages and poorly armed or armored settlements and command areas, but they were starting to go after entrenched positions looking for blood. This meant that it was impossible for the Germans and the Russians to fight each other, but more importantly, that the existence of those wolves jeopardized their ability to survive the harsh winter on the Eastern Front. Sensing a complete and total destruction, the Germans and the Russians struck up a truce, and over the course of several days, basically machine gunned down several hundred wolves before finally returning to their trenches and turning those machine guns on their original targets, each other. Again, it seems unlikely that more than one major wolf truce was called. I could find sources for only one, but it does seem possible and plausible that smaller wolf truces between light or armed squads were more likely. But again, I think this is the kind of stuff that I love. Imagine the horrors of World War I, of which we could probably do an entire video. You have things like chemical warfare and gas attacks, starvation on a massive front, and again, that was the big reason we had to fight these wolves, was starvation. Those wolves were picking clean their stores, taking out the communities that sheltered them and protect them from the winter. All of those things were major issues for the German and the Russian soldiers at this time, but imagine you're facing the normal amount of starvation, the horrors of chemical warfare, the newly unveiled difficulties of machine guns and tanks, the pre-Geneva Convention horrors of trench warfare, where you were as like to be eliminated by something like a trench gun or a scatter gun, or have your helmet and head and skull punctured by something like a trench knife, or you just have your face beaten in by a trench knife with, that lovely little brass knuckles part that we use. All of those things are terrifying, but imagine that you and your men think an attack is coming, you hear screams coming up from over the trench, only to find the enemy running towards you, but they're not carrying their weapons, they're fleeing in terror, and you watch as men are ripped to shreds, dragged back into the mist, and eventually the screams stop, and you start hearing the lone howls, and you realize that not only are the wolves in front of you, but they're on every side and behind you as well. I can think of very little else that would terrify me if I was sitting in that trench. Again, aside from a mustard gas attack, that sounds pretty scary to me. But we round out all of this by returning to one of the most horrific times in human history, the Crusades. Now, the Crusades had quite a lot going for it in terms of horror, but I want you to close your eyes, open your historical imagination, and imagine for a moment that you're attacking a Crusader city, or fighting against a band of Crusader knights. They're well-trained, well-armed, and disciplined, as you have come to expect, but they wear gold-plated masks, elaborate ones, in fact, baked into their armor. You notice that much of their bodies are covered. Now, this is strange because, yes, a knight would cover themselves, but these men seem to be wearing far greater amounts of padding and clothing than their companions or their compatriots would usually do, and especially in the middle of the desert in the scorching heat. This seems odd to you, and eventually, over the course of that combat, you manage to knock one of them down and end him, and you decide to unmask him, only to find the putrid stench of decaying flesh, and you realize, as one of your fellows eliminates a limb from one of these knights, and he keeps fighting, that you are not against usual enemies. You are against the Order of St. Lazarus. The Order of St. Lazarus is a phenomenal order, a subset of the Knights Hospitaller, or the Knights Hospitaller, however you want to say it, but a subset of that order. And they were composed originally of the knights who cared for the lepers in the hospitals of the Crusades. It wasn't until the fall of Jerusalem, however, that the knights were given dispensation to fight, and for many of those knights who had, knightly training but had contracted leprosy over the course of their work, actually trying to care for the sick, this was seen as the ultimate way to go out. You knew that leprosy was going to be a slow and inevitable end, and you decided that this was going to be an opportunity for you to put your money where your mouth is and die a hero's death. A couple things I want to mention about the Order of St. Lazarus, because this is a truly horrific concept, right? The idea of these horrific zombified knights essentially charging towards you, bile seeping from their eyes, ooze falling from their mouths, unable to close their jaws because half of their face is lying somewhere on the battlefield after you whacked it off with a warhammer. These are truly horrific images. However, a couple things that I want to point out, as terrifying as the Knights of St. Lazarus are, as the Order of St. Lazarus is, their fighting did not happen often, and in fact it didn't happen during the Crusades proper. The Order of St. Lazarus, as I mentioned before, does not actually get a chance to fight until the fall of Jerusalem. They actually fought a couple times during the Siege of Acre, and were eventually subsumed into the Greater Hospitaller Order as a whole. The Order of St. Lazarus does still exist in much the same way that the Knights Hospitaller do, or Hospitaller, again, however you want to say that. I had some people in the comments being like, you can't say it that way. You can say either one. It's fine. It's like Caribbean or Caribbean. Relax. But again, one of these things is this is important to make note of. They were really only in combat a few times. And this makes sense historically speaking. It was not commonplace for individuals in the middle of warfare to rely on the sick and the dying in terms of battle. But desperate times did call for desperate measures. Religious zeal is an incredible motivator. And let's be honest, many of the faculties and facets of leprosy lend it to being kind of an effective disease in the short term for combat. You have an inability to feel pain. You have an inability to be stopped in the face of injury because you can't feel that pain, and it has a great demoralization effect on the enemy. If you're convinced that you are going to fall in battle anyway, it makes sense, and again, many of these knights saw this as their final opportunity to reach a hero's end and a reward that would hopefully wait for them on the other side. Again, the idea of these horrific zombified knights charging at us, I think, is a truly horrific concept, and one that I would love to see a horror movie about, but I would also love if you baked into your role-playing games. Now, before we get to the games section of this video, and I know that I baked a disclaimer, and I'm going to give you another shout out to some safety tools. Now, usually, if you've watched our videos for any length of time, you know that I believe this is a genuinely decent thing to do. I don't think you have to make them huge. A simple X card, a lines and veils conversation during your session 0, that helps a ton. But I want to actually bring up a horror tool that I think does really, really well, and that comes to us courtesy of a game called Cult Divinity Lost. If you're a horror role-playing game fan like I am, you are probably familiar with Cult Divinity Lost. It is kind of the marquee title for tabletop role-playing in the horror space, other than Call of Cthulhu, and I know I'm going to make some folks a little bit mad here. I kind of prefer Cult Divinity Lost to Call of Cthulhu, if I'm being honest. I find this system to be far more evocative and far more interesting, and really lean into the nitty-gritty of the horror that I absolutely love. One of the safety tools that Cult Divinity Lost uses is something called a player contract, and in it basically says the player is going into this experience ready to be scared, and it encourages the player to be scared. But in addition to that, one of the cool parts about this is it encourages the player to talk about their fears and the things that do scare them with the GM. Now, the reason I love this is it gives the players some agency to sort of contribute to their own fears and to have a discussion about what they do want to be terrified by. But it also gives the GM to be like, hey, how far am I allowed to push this before you're going to get uncomfortable? It just encourages that discussion, and I really love that this is kind of baked into one of the best horror role-playing game systems on the market right now. I think it's a thing that's worth sharing. Now that we've discussed that, however, let's talk about how to use some of these concepts in our games, and I'm going to start with the use of torture in our games. Now, if you've played a role-playing game before, or you've utilized an RPG concept before, I feel like this happens in every GM or DM's first game. You players get together, they capture an NPC, and somebody's like, you know what, let's get this information by any means necessary. In one of my very earliest campaigns, I had a player basically tie a man to the rafters, of a barn and then essentially play the fantasy equivalent of Kids Bop music to this person, which I think we can all agree is most likely one of the most horrific things I've ever seen possible. However, one of the things that I would encourage you to do is to lean into the actual function of torture. One of the reasons that people have stopped doing this so much is it really isn't all that effective, because when someone is being tortured, they'll just tell you whatever you want to hear to get the pain to stop. And to simulate this, I love the idea of making torture in our RPGs a push your luck kind of mechanic. So if you're in that green area, it's actively harmful. They're going to try to deceive you. But if you go too far in one direction, it's going to be actively harmful to you. Again, it's useless. Sometimes it's just right, but most of the time it's going to be too much, or again, actively useless or harmful to the players who are performing the action. You're only using this technique, right, to get information if you are desperate. This is a weapon of last resort. And the reason it is because I think if you're a game master, and we'll go over this in a second, you should play around with the idea that torture affects individuals differently. You can use devices to push that meter up. Aid, things like smelling salts or special type of food that maybe the imprisoned likes, some healing magic, that would be potentially helpful to sort of move that needle back. But again, lean into the idea that every individual is different, their pain thresholds, their tolerance, and their desire to give up that information. So your players might think it looks a little bit like the metric that we shared at the beginning, but it could be something like this, and I would make it unique to every NPC. Again, you want the players to engage with this tool only as a weapon of last resort, because they don't know what is just right and what is actively harming them, and I would keep that information a secret from your players. But now let's lean into our good furry friends, the wolves, and talk about how we might use a horde of slavering carnivores as a weapon and a tool for interesting variant rules in our role-playing games. I think the idea for this is just to make the survival meaningful. I would, base this, instead of a base builder, think of it like a base destroyer, with the wolves slowly chipping away at the resolve of the defenders, but also chipping away at the physical ramparts and fortifications that the players have been using. One of the things that I think you could do, and again, I borrowed heavily from World War I and its logistical nightmares for this type of game, is imagine the players can sacrifice supplies and time, and I realize I spelled supplies wrong, but essentially what that does is it helps you to erect walls, gives bonus health to combatants, maybe even a temporary action that expires in a week. That way they can't just sandbag it forever. I think these are cool ways to do it, but every single round that the players have to engage, those wolves are slowly but surely chipping away at those supplies and making it more and more difficult for the defenders to survive. Now, last but certainly not least, I want to talk about our good friends, the Order of St. Lazarus, and the way that I would bake these zombie knights into my game. One of the big fears when fighting the Order of St. Lazarus was the idea that their disease was so horrific and contagious. And realistically, like the blood of a zombie, I want to bake this into our games. And what more horrifying way could be the idea that maybe your players could contract the disease. And I would make it so that this disease is well and truly a sentence to the afterlife. This is going to remove them from the life stream, essentially. If it's contracted, it's not an if, it's a when the players finally bite the bullet. And so I think each initial wound, and I realize I spelled wound wrong too, crazy work there, good spelling Kyle, would get you a 1% chance to contract the illness, but every subsequent hit doubles it. So the first one will be 2%, the next one is 4%, and make the players roll it themselves. Make them roll the D% in the middle of the table so that when it fails, when something goes wrong, the players are well and truly aware of exactly what happened and exactly who did it to them. And eventually, they did it to themselves, which I think is kind of cool. And with that, my friends, it brings us to the end of our historical horror video. I hope you have enjoyed this, and I hope that you think a little bit of some of the crazy, terrifying, and horrifying things that happened in our past and use them for, inspiration in your own games. If you would like to support us and our games, you can again use that QR code to get digital links in the description below. It takes you to our itch.io page. And Desks and Dorks now officially has a Patreon as well. Patreon.com/Desks and Dorks 207. This is where you can get early access to Desks and Dorks content. You can get your name shouted out in the videos, and you get an RPG every single month. This month, we're doing an RPG scavenger hunt fusion called One Final Stand, about a group of disparate and desperate people trying to defend a location using only the things that they can scrounge up right before the game begins. If that sounds like something that interests you, again, patreon.com/Desks and Dorks 207. That's the best place to get it. And now I get to shout out our phenomenal patrons. And again, a massive thank you to our patrons, Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, and Ignacio Zeggers. You guys are absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for helping to bring these videos to life and for supporting Desks and Dorks in the way that you do. But until next time, I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You have all been absolutely amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.